Monsieur Frere thanked me with all his heart. He was hardly able to believe the good news I brought him. As to the Empress, she was made happy by the joy experienced by this faithful servant, who gave her to the end of his life proofs of his entire devotion. I have been assured that in 1814, at the time of the Emperor's departure for the island of Elba, Monsieur Frey was not the last to blame my conduct, the motives of which he did not know. I am unwilling to believe it, for it seems to me that in his place, if I had thought myself unable to defend an absent friend, I should have at least kept silence. As I have said, the Empress was extremely generous. She distributed a great deal in charity. Many emigres lived solely on her benefactions. She kept up a very active correspondence with the Sisters of Charity, who nursed the sick and sent them a multitude of things. Her valets were dispatched in all directions to carry to the poor the assistance of her inexhaustible beneficence. A great many other persons were sent daily on similar missions, and all these alms, all these multiplied and widely diffused gifts were made of inestimable worth by the grace with which they were offered and the discernment with which they were distributed. I could cite 1,000 examples of this delicate generosity. Monsieur de Beauharnais, at the time of his marriage with Josephine, had a natural daughter named Adele. The Empress cherished her as if she had been her own child. She took the greatest care of her education, endowed her generously, and married her to a prefect of the empire. If the Empress showed so much affection for a child who was not hers, it is impossible to form an idea of her love and devotion for Queen Hortense and Prince Eugène. It is true to say that her children fully returned it, and that never in the world has there been a better or happier mother. She was proud of her 2 children and always spoke of them with an enthusiasm which seemed very natural to those who had known the Queen of Holland and the Viceroy of Italy. I have told how, when made an orphan in his tenderest years by the revolutionary scaffold, young Beauharnais had gained the heart of General Bonaparte by coming to ask him for his father's sword. It is also known how this action gave the general a desire to see Josephine, and what resulted from this interview. When Madame de Beauharnais had become the wife of General Bonaparte, Eugène entered the military career and at once attached himself to the fortunes of his stepfather, who summoned him to his side in Italy in the capacity of aide-de-camp. He was chief of squadron in the chasseurs of the consular guard when, at the immortal Battle of Marengo, he shared all the dangers of him who took so much pleasure in calling him his son. A few years later, the chief of squadron had become Viceroy of Italy, heir presumptive of the imperial crown, a title which in truth he did not long retain, and husband of the daughter of a king. The vice-queen, Auguste Emily of Bavaria, was as good and beautiful as an angel. I was at Malmaison one day when the Empress had just received the portrait of her daughter-in-law, surrounded by 3 or 4 children. One on her shoulder, the other at her feet, a third in her arms. All of them had angelic faces. On seeing me, the Empress deigned to call me to come and admire this gathering of charming heads. I saw that she had tears in her eyes while talking to me. These portraits were well executed, and I afterwards had occasion to perceive that the resemblances were perfect. Then the question was, what toys and rarities to buy for these dear children? The Empress went herself to select the presents she intended for them and had them packed under her very own eyes. A valet de chambre of the prince has assured me that at the time of the divorce, Prince Eugène wrote his wife a very melancholy letter. Perhaps he expressed in it some regret for not being the Emperor's adopted son. The princess answered with tenderness. She said to him, among other things, "It is not the heir of the Emperor that I married, and that I love. It is Eugène de Beauharnais." The prince read this phrase and several others before the person from whom I have the fact, and who was affected even to tears by them. Such a woman merited more than a throne. After that event so terrible to the heart of the Empress, who could never be consoled for it, the excellent princess never left Malmaison again, except to make several journeys to Navarre. Each time that I returned to Paris with the emperor, I'd scarcely arrived when my first care was to go to Malmaison. I seldom carried a letter from the emperor. He only wrote to Josephine on grand occasions. Tell the empress that I am well and that I desire that she may be happy. That was what His Majesty almost always said to me when he saw me about to start. As soon as I arrived, the empress left everything else to come to talk to me. I often remained an hour and even 2 hours with her. During this time, nothing but the emperor was spoken of. I had to tell her all he had suffered on the journey, if he had been sad or gay, well or ill. She wept over the details I gave her, recommended 1,000 precautions for his health, and the cares with which she wished me to surround him. Afterwards, she would deign to question me about myself, my fate, the health of my wife, her former protege. Then she would dismiss me with a letter for His Majesty, begging me to say to the emperor how happy she would be if he came to see her. Before the departure for Russia, the empress, uneasy about this war, of which she utterly disapproved, again renewed her recommendations. She presented me with her portrait, saying, "My good Constant, I rely on you. If the emperor was sick, would you let me know, wouldn't you? You didn't hide anything from me. I love him so!" Assuredly, the empress had 1,000 means of getting news of His Majesty, but I am persuaded that if she had received 100 letters a day from persons surrounding the emperor, she would have read and reread them all with the same avidity. When I returned to St. Cloud or the Tuileries, the emperor would ask me how Josephine was, and if I had found her gay, he received with pleasure the letters that I brought and hastened to open them. Every time, that being on a journey or at the campaign in His Majesty's suite, I wrote to my wife, I would speak of the emperor, and the good princess was enchanted to have my wife show her the letters. Everything, in a word, which had the least relation to her husband interested the empress to a degree that thoroughly proved the singular tenderness she always felt for him, after as well as before their separation. Too generous and unable to adapt her expenses to her resources, it often happened that the empress found herself obliged to send her purveyors away empty-handed on the very days she had herself set for the payment of their accounts. This once came to the emperor's ears, and there was a very lively discussion on the subject between the two, which ended in the decision that thereafter no merchant or purveyor should come to the chateau without a letter from the lady of the bedchamber or the private secretary. This well-considered resolution was executed with much exactness up to the time of the divorce. At the close of this explanation, the empress wept a good deal and promised to be more economical. The emperor pardoned her, embraced her, and peace was made. This, I think, was the last quarrel of the sort that disturbed the imperial couple. I have been told that after the divorce, there having occurred a deficit in the budget of the empress, the emperor addressed some reproaches to the steward of Malmaison, which very naturally reached Josephine. This good mistress, keenly affected by the unpleasantness to which her steward had been subjected, and not knowing how to establish a better state of things, assembled a household council, at which she chose to preside in a linen robe made without any trimmings. This linen robe had been made in a great hurry and was never worn again. The empress, whom the necessity of giving a refusal always reduced to despair, was continually besieged by merchants who assured her that they had made such or such a thing expressly for her use, and implored her not to send it back because they would not know where else to place their goods. The empress kept all they brought, but then followed the necessity of paying for them. The empress was always extremely polite towards all the members of her household. It never happened that a reproach fell from her mouth which opened only to say flattering things. If any one of her ladies gave her cause for dissatisfaction, the only punishment she inflicted was an absolute silence on her own part, which lasted 1, 2, 3, 8 days, more or less, according to the gravity of the fault. Well, this penalty, so easy in appearance, was cruel to the greater number of them. The empress knew so well how to make herself beloved. In the days of the consulate, Madame Bonaparte often received from cities conquered by her husband, or for persons who desired to obtain her good offices with the first consul, packages of costly furniture and curiosities of every kind, pictures, stuffs, etc. At first, these gifts greatly flattered Madame Bonaparte. She was as pleased as a child to see the cases opened and find out what was inside. She helped herself to unpack and carry all these pretty things, but the packages soon became so considerable and were so often repeated that it became necessary to have an apartment to put them in, of which my father-in-law kept the key. There the cases remained intact until it should please Madame Bonaparte to have them opened. When the first consul decided to take up his residence at St. Cloud, my father-in-law had to leave Malmaison and install himself at the new palace, the master of which wished him to superintend the furnishing. Before departing, my father-in-law rendered an account to Madame Bonaparte of all that he had in his charge. At this time, the cases, which filled 2 rooms from floor to ceiling, were opened in her presence. Madame Bonaparte was amazed at such riches. It was nothing but marbles, bronzes, and magnificent pictures. Eugène, Hortense, and the sisters of the first consul had a good share of them. The rest were employed in decorating the apartments of Malmaison. The taste of the Empress that she had for jewels extended for some time to antique curiosities, engraved stones, and medals. Monsieur Denon encouraged this whim, and in the end persuaded the good Josephine that she was a perfect connoisseur in antiques and ought to have a cabinet at Malmaison with the curator etc. This proposition, which flattered the self-love of the Empress, was favorably received. The site was chosen, and Monsieur de M was chosen for curator, and the new cabinet was enriched by levies on the rich furnishing of the apartments of the chateau. Monsieur Denon, who had given this idea, undertook to make a collection of medals. But this taste, coming so suddenly, vanished as it came. The cabinet was taken to make a company salon. The antiques were relegated to the antechamber of the bathroom. And Monsieur de M, having no longer anything to take care of, lived habitually in Paris. Some time after this, 2 ladies of the palace took the notion to persuade Her Majesty the Empress that nothing would be more beautiful or more worthy of her than a set of assorted antique stones, Greek and Roman. Several chamberlains supported this invention, which did not fail to please Her Majesty. She greatly loved everything which bordered on originality. One morning, therefore, as I was dressing the Emperor, I saw the Empress enter. After some moments of conversation, "Bonaparte," said she, "these ladies have advised me to have a set of antique stones. I have come to beg you to tell Monsieur Denon to choose some very fine ones for me." The Emperor burst into peals of laughter, and at first flatly refused. Then arrived the Grand Marshal of the palace, whom the Emperor informed of the request presented by the Empress and asked his opinion. The Duc de Rock found the thing very reasonable and united his persuasions to those of the Empress. "It is an egregious folly," said the Emperor, "but after all, one must submit to what women desire. Duroc, go to the cabinet of antiques yourself and choose what will be necessary." The Duc de Friaul soon came back with the most beautiful stones in the collection. The crown jeweler mounted them magnificently, but the weight of the set was enormous and the Empress never wore it. Although I may be accused of tiresome repetitions, I will say that the Empress seized with extreme eagerness every opportunity of doing good. One morning when she was breakfasting alone with His Majesty, the cries of an infant were suddenly heard coming from a private staircase. The Emperor became gloomy. He frowned and asked brusquely what this meant. I went to inquire, and I found a newly born baby carefully and neatly wrapped up, lying in a sort of upright cradle with its body encircled by a ribbon to which a folded paper was attached. I came back to say what I'd seen. "Oh, Constant, bring me the cradle," said the Empress at once. The Emperor first refused and expressed his surprise and dissatisfaction that anyone should have been able to enter thus into the interior of his apartments. Her Majesty the Empress, thereupon observing that it must have been someone belonging to the household, he turned and looked at me as if to ask if it were I who had this idea. I shook my head in the negative. At this moment, the infant began to cry again. The Emperor could not avoid smiling, even while complaining and saying, "Josephine, send the little monkey away." The Empress, wishing to profit by this return of good humor, sent me for the cradle, which I brought. She caressed the newly born, quieted it, and read it the paper, which was a petition for the parents. Then she approached the Emperor and urged him to caress the baby, a little also, which he did without requiring too much persuasion, for the Emperor himself likes to play with infants. Finally, Her Majesty, the Empress, after having placed a roll of Napoleons in the cradle, sent the baby to the concierge of the palace so that it might be returned to its parents. Here's another of Her Majesty's good deeds. I had the happiness of being a witness of this one also. Some months before the coronation, a little girl of between 4 and 5 had been rescued from the Seine, and a charitable lady, Madame Fabienne Pilet, had hastened to give an asylum to the poor orphan. At the time of the coronation, the Empress, being informed of this fact, desired to see the child. And after looking at it compassionately for some moments, and sincerely and gracefully offering her protection to Madame Pilet and her husband, she told him that she would be responsible for the little girl's future. Then, with that delicacy and that affectionate tone, which were natural to her, the Empress added, "Your good action has given you too many rights over the poor little thing for me to prevent you from finishing your good work yourselves. Hence, I ask your permission to defray the expenses of her education, but it is you who will put her in a school and watch over her. I will be merely her second benefactress." It was the most touching thing in the world to see Her Majesty, as she uttered these delicate words, pass her hand through the hand of the poor little thing, as she had just called her, and kiss her forehead with a motherly kindness. Monsieur and Madame Pilet withdrew, deeply affected by this touching scene. Chapter 6. When General Junot was appointed ambassador to Portugal, I was reminded of a rather comic anecdote, which had highly amused the Emperor. At the camp of Bologna, the Emperor had made it the order of the day that all military men must give up powder and cut their hair a la Titus. Many grumbled, but all ended in submitting to the orders of that chief, except an old grenadier belonging to the corps commanded by General Junot. Unable to decide on the sacrifice of his ringlets on his cue, this hero swore that he would only resign himself to it in case his general would cut off the first lock with his own hands. None of the officers who busied themselves about the matter having been able to obtain any other reply, it was reported to the general. "Don't let that be an objection," replied the latter. "Bring the rascal to me." The grenadier was summoned, and General Junot gave the first snap of the shears to a greasy and powdered lock. Then he gave 20 francs to the old fellow, who went away quite satisfied to let the regimental barber finish the operation. The Emperor, having heard of this adventure, laughed heartily and strongly approved General Junot, whom he complimented on his condescension. 1,000 similar traits might be cited of the good nature blended with military roughness which characterized General Junot. Some of another sort, which did less honor to his brains, might also be cited. He was so unaccustomed to self-restraint that he often fell into rages, which more frequently than not resulted in his forgetting his rank and the reserve it should have imposed on him. Everybody has heard of his adventure in the gambling house, where he tore up the cards, upset the furniture, and beat the bankers and croupiers to indemnify himself for the loss of his money. The worst of it was that he was governor of Paris at the time. On being informed of this scandal, the Emperor sent for him and asked in great anger if he had sworn to live and die a fool. This might, in the sequel, have been taken for a prediction when the unhappy general died in a fit of mental alienation. He replied in a not very measured term to the reprimands of the Emperor and was sent to the army of England, perhaps to give him time to cool down. It was not merely in gaming houses that the governor of Paris thus compromised his dignity. Other adventures of a still gayer kind have been related to me, but I must forbid myself to repeat them. The fact is that General Junot piqued himself far less on respecting the proprieties than upon being one of the most skillful shots with pistol in the army. When riding in the country, he would often spur his horse to a gallop, holding a pistol in each hand, and he never failed of his aim. As he passed the heads of the ducks and fowls he selected his targets, he cut off a little branch of a tree at 25 paces, and I have even heard, I am far from guaranteeing the reality of this feat, that he had once, with the consent of the party whose life his imprudence thus imperiled, shot through the middle of a clay pipe, scarcely 3 inches long, which a soldier was holding between his teeth. In the first journey that Madame Bonaparte made to Italy to rejoin her husband, she stopped for some time in Milan. At this time, she had in her service a chambermaid called Louise, tall and very handsome, and who bestowed many well-paid-for favors on the brave Juno. As soon as her waiting on her mistress was finished for the day, Louise, still more adorned than Madame Bonaparte, would drive through the city and the environs in an elegant equipage, and often eclipsed the wife of the commander-in-chief. On their return to Paris, the latter obliged his wife to dismiss the fair Louise, who, abandoned by her inconstant lover, fell into great poverty. I have since often seen her come to the Empress Josephine to ask assistance, which was always kindly granted. This young woman, who had dared to rival Madame Bonaparte in elegance, ended, I believe, by marrying an English jockey who made her very unhappy, and she died in the most miserable condition. The first consul of the French Republic, on becoming Emperor of the French, could no longer content himself in Italy with the title of president. Hence, deputies from the Cisalpine Republic again crossed the mountains, consulted together in Paris, and offered His Majesty the title of King of Italy, which he accepted. A few days after his acceptance, the Emperor set out for Milan, where he was to be crowned. I returned with the greatest pleasure to that beautiful country, of which I had retained the most agreeable souvenirs in spite of the fatigues and dangers of war. The circumstances were now very different. It was as a sovereign that the emperor was about to cross the Alps, Piedmont, and Lombardy, every gorge, every river, and every defile, which it had been necessary to carry by force of arms. On our first journey in 1800, the escort of the first consul was an army. In 1805, it was a wholly Pacific cortege of chamberlains, pages, ladies of honor, and officers of the palace. Before his departure, the emperor held at the baptismal font at St. Cloud with Madame Mary's godmother, Prince Napoleon Louis, the second son of Prince Louis, His Majesty's brother. All three of the sons of Queen Hortense had the emperor for a godfather, if I mistake not, but the one he liked best was the eldest of the three, Prince Napoleon Charles, who died at the age of 5, Prince Royal of Holland. I shall speak later on of this lovely child, whose death was the despair of his father and mother, one of the emperor's greatest chagrins, and may be considered as the cause of the gravest offense. After the baptismal festivities, we started for Italy. The Empress Josephine made the journey. Whenever it was possible, the emperor liked to take her with him. For her part, she would have liked always to accompany her husband, whether it were possible or not. The emperor usually was bent on keeping his journeys very secret, and he would ask at midnight for horses to go to Mayence or to Milan, precisely as if it were a matter of an excursion to St. Cloud or Rambouillet. I do not know on which of these journeys it was that His Majesty had decided not to take the Empress Josephine. The emperor dreaded less that charade of ladies and women who formed the suite of Her Majesty than the annoyances occasioned by the packages and cases by which they were ordinarily accompanied. He wanted to travel faster and without pomp, and to spare the cities through which he passed an enormous increase of expense. Hence he ordered that everything should be in readiness for a start at 1 o'clock in the morning, an hour at which the Empress was usually asleep. But in spite of all precautions, some indiscretion made the Empress aware of what was going on. The Emperor had promised that she should accompany him on his next journey, and yet he had deceived her and was going without her. And what she called her women, but impatient with their slowness. Her Majesty sprang out of the foot of the bed, slipped on the first article of clothing that came under her hand, ran out of the chamber in slippers without stockings, crying like a little child that is being taken back to school. She ran through the apartments, descended the stairs with rapid steps, and threw herself into the emperor's arms just as he was about to get into the carriage. It was high time. For another minute, he would have been off, as nearly always happened when he saw his wife in tears. The emperor was moved. She perceived it, and already she was crouching down in the bottom of the carriage. But Her Majesty was not half dressed. The emperor covered her with his pelisse, and before starting himself gave orders that at the first relay his wife should find all that she might need. Leaving the empress at Fontainebleau, the emperor went on to Brienne, where he arrived at 6 in the evening. Madame de Brienne and de Lomenie and several ladies of the city were awaiting him at the foot of the chateau steps. He entered the salon and gave a most gracious reception to all who were presented to him. Thence he passed into the gardens, conversing familiarly with Madame de Brienne and de Lomenie. and recalling with a surprising fidelity of memory the least particulars of the sojourn he had made in childhood at the military school of Brienne. His Majesty admitted his hosts and several persons of their circle to his table. After dinner he played whist with Madame de Brienne, de Vendœuvre, and de Nolivre. And at the game as at the table, the conversation of the emperor appeared animated and interesting, and he displayed a gaiety and affability which charmed everybody. His Majesty spent the night at the Chateau of Brienne and rose early to go and visit the field of La Rotière, formerly one of his favorite excursions. He took the greatest pleasure in going over these places where he had passed his earliest youth. He pointed them out with a kind of pride, and each of his movements, each of his reflections seemed to say, "See where I started from and where I have arrived." His Majesty walked ahead of the persons who accompanied him and pleased himself by being the first to name the different places where he found himself. A peasant, seeing him thus at a distance from his suite, called out to us familiarly, "Hey, citizen, will the emperor be along presently?" "Yes," replied the emperor himself. "Be patient." The evening before, the emperor had asked Madame de Brienne about Mother Marguerite, an old woman who was called, as she was called, who occupied a thatched cottage in the middle of the wood, and to whom the pupils of the military school had been accustomed to pay frequent visits. His Majesty had not forgotten this name, and seemed as much pleased as surprised to find that she who bore it was still living. Continuing his morning ride, the emperor galloped to the door of the cottage, alighted from his horse, and entered the house of the good peasant. The sight of the latter had been enfeebled by age, and besides, the emperor had changed so much that even with good eyes it would have been difficult for her to recognize him. "Good day, Mother Marguerite," said the emperor, bowing to the old woman. "Are you not curious to see the emperor?" "Yes, indeed, my good sir, I'm very curious, so much so that here is a little basket of fresh eggs that I'm going to carry to Madame, and then I will rest at the chateau to try and see the emperor. The trouble is I shall not see him so well today as of old, when he came to drink milk at Mother Marguerite's. He was not the emperor then, but it's all the same. He made the others march. Faith! You ought to see him. The milk, the eggs, the brown bread, the broken dishes. He took care that I should be paid for them, and he himself by paying with his own Scot." "How, Mother Marguerite?" returned the emperor, smiling. "You have not forgotten Bonaparte?" "Forgotten, my good sir? Do you suppose one forgets a young man like that, who was good, serious, and even sad sometimes, but always good to poor people? I am only a peasant woman, but I could have predicted that young man would make his way." "He has not made his way very badly, no?" "Faith, no." While this short dialogue was going on, the emperor had at first turned his back to the door, and consequently to the light, which could only enter there. But his Majesty had gradually approached the old woman, and when he was close to her, the emperor, whose face was then illuminated by the light from outside, began to rub his hands and say, trying to recall the tone and manners of his early youth when he came to the peasant's house, "Come, Mother Marguerite, some milks and some fresh eggs. We are dying of hunger." The good woman seemed trying to collect her memories and began to look at the emperor with great attention. "Well, mother, you were very sure just now of recognizing Bonaparte? We two are old acquaintances." While the emperor was saying these last words to her, the peasant had fallen at his feet. He lifted her with the most touching kindness and said, "Truly, Mother Marguerite, I have a schoolboy's appetite. Have you nothing to give me?" The good woman, who was beside herself with happiness, served his Majesty with eggs and milk. His repast finished, his Majesty gave his old hostess a purse full of gold, saying, "You know, Mother Marguerite, that I like to have people pay their Scot. Adieu, I shall not forget you." And while the emperor was remounting his horse, the good old woman on the threshold was promising with tears of joy to pray to God for him. At his levee, his Majesty had been speaking with someone of the possibility of finding some of his old acquaintances, and an anecdote concerning General Junot had been related, which greatly diverted him. The general, on his return from Egypt, finding himself at Montbar, where he had spent several years of his childhood, had diligently hunted up the companions in school at boyish tricks, and had found several with whom he chatted in a gay and familiar way about his early frolics. Afterwards they went to revisit the different localities, each of which awakened in them some souvenir of their youth. On the public square of the city, the general perceived an old man walking along with a magisterial air and carrying a large cane. He immediately ran up to him, threw his arms about his neck, and almost stifled him with repeated caresses. The promenader, disengaging himself with difficulty from these ardent embraces, gazed in wonder at General Junot, not knowing to what he should attribute such expressive tenderness on the part of a military man wearing the uniform of a superior officer and all the marks of high rank. "What?" cried the latter. "Don't you recognize me?" "Citizen General, I beg you to excuse me, but I have not an idea." "Zounds, my dear master, have you forgotten the laziest, the most unruly, the hardest to discipline of all your pupils?" "1,000 pardons! Might you be Monsieur Junot?" "Himself," replied the general, renewing his embraces and laughing with his comrades at the singular marks by which he had been recognized. As for His Majesty the Emperor, if the memory of one of his old masters had failed him, it would not have been by such signs that it would have been revived, for everybody knows that he distinguished himself at the military school by his assiduity at his tasks and the regularity and gravity of his conduct. A meeting of the same sort, saving the difference of souvenirs, awaited the Emperor at Brienne while he was visiting the old military school which had fallen into ruins, and pointing out to those who surrounded him the site of the study halls, the dormitories, refectories, etc. Someone presented to him an ecclesiastic who had been sub-prefect of one of the classes of the school. The Emperor recognized him at once and uttered an exclamation of surprise. His Majesty conversed for more than 20 minutes with this gentleman and left him penetrated with gratitude. Before leaving Brienne to return to Fontainebleau, the Emperor obtained from the mayor a note of the most pressing needs of the commune, and on his departure left a considerable sum for the poor and the hospitals at Troyes, as in every place he passed through, the Emperor left marks of his generosity. The widow of a general officer retired at Joinville. I am sorry to have forgotten the name of this venerable lady, who was more than an octogenarian, came to Troyes in spite of her age to ask assistance from His Majesty. Her husband having served only before the Revolution, his retiring pension had been withdrawn by the Republic, and she was in the greatest destitution. The brother of General Voutemont, mayor of the commune of the neighborhood of Troyes, had the kindness to consult me as to the measures he ought to take in order to introduce this lady to the Emperor, and I advised him to have her inscribed on the list of His Majesty's private audiences. I myself took the liberty of speaking to Madame de Blanc to the Emperor, and the audience was granted. I do not pretend to claim the merit of this, for His Majesty was easily accessible when traveling. When the good lady came to her audience with Monsieur Voutemont, whose municipal scarf came with the rights of entry, I happened to meet them. She stopped to thank me for the very slight service which she claimed I had rendered her, and told me she had been obliged to pawn the 6 silver forks and spoons she still had left in order to defray the expenses of her journey. That on arriving at Troyes in a wretched farm carryall, covered with a cloth thrown over the hoops, and which had shaken her up dreadfully, she had been unable to find any room in the taverns, which were all crowded on account of the presence of their Majesties, and would have been obliged to sleep in her carryall but for the obligingness of Mr. Voutemont, who had resigned his room and offered her his services. In spite of her more than 80 years and her distress, this worthy lady told her story with an air of gentle gaiety, and as she ended it, she cast a grateful look at her guide, on whose arm she was leaning. At this moment the usher came to tell that her turn had arrived, and she went into the audience room. Monsieur Voutemont waited for her while chatting with me. When she returned, she told us, restraining her emotion with great difficulty, that the Emperor had kindly taken the memoir she presented, read it attentively, and immediately handed it to a minister who was near him, recommending him to do what was right about it before night. She received the next morning the brevet for a pension of 3,000 francs, the first year of which was paid that very day. At Lyon, where Cardinal Fesch was Archbishop, the Emperor stayed at the Archiepiscopal Palace. During the sojourn of their Majesties, the Cardinal put himself to much trouble in order that his nephew should have whatever he might desire without the least delay. In his ardor to please, Monseigneur addressed himself to me several times a day so as to be sure that he lacked nothing. Hence, everything went well and had been very well. The cardinal's zeal was noticed by all the members of the household. For my part, I thought I observed that this zeal acquired new force whenever there was a question of paying all the expenses occasioned by the visit of their majesties, which were considerable. His Eminence obtained, I think, a very good interest on his advance of money, and his generous hospitality was largely indemnified by the generosity of his guests. The crossing of Mont-Cenis was not nearly as difficult as that of Mont-Saint-Bernard had been. However, the road ordered by His Majesty was not yet begun. The carriages had to be taken to pieces at the foot of the mountain and transported on muleback. Their Majesties crossed the mount partly on foot and partly in litters of the greatest beauty, which had been prepared at Turin. That of the emperor was lined with crimson satin and trimmed with gold galloon and fringe, and that of the empress with blue satin with silver fringe and trimmings. The snow had been carefully swept up and removed. On arriving at the convent, they were received with much cordiality by the good monks. The emperor, who held them in a singular esteem, conversed a good deal with them and did not go away without leaving behind many rich tokens of his munificence. Hardly had he arrived at Turin when he issued a decree relative to the improvement of their hospice, and he continued to aid them until his downfall. Their Majesties halted for some days at Turin, where they inhabited the former palace of the kings of Sardinia, which was made an imperial residence by the decree issued during our actual stay, as also the chateau of Stupinigi, situated at a little distance from the city. The Pope rejoined their Majesties at Stupinigi. The Holy Father had quitted Paris almost at the same time that we did, and before his departure had received magnificent presents from the Emperor. There was an altar of gold, with the most richly wrought chandeliers and sacred vessels, a superb tiara, Gobelin tapestries, and Savonnerie carpets, and a statue of the emperor in Sevres porcelain. The Empress had likewise presented His Holiness with a vase of the same manufacture, ornamented with paintings by the best artists. This masterpiece was at least 4 feet high and 2.5 feet wide at the opening. It had been made expressly to be offered to the Holy Father and represented, as well as I can remember, the ceremony of the coronation. Each of the cardinals of the papal suite had received a box of beautiful workmanship with the portrait of the emperor enriched with diamonds, and all the persons in the service of Pius VII had more or less valuable presents. All of these different objects had been successively brought into the apartments of the emperor by the purveyors, and I had taken note of them by His Majesty's orders as fast as they arrived. On his side, the Holy Father had also caused very beautiful gifts to be accepted by all officers of His Majesty's household who had done him any personal services during his stay in Paris. From Stupinigi, we went to Alexandria. The day after his arrival, the emperor rose very early, visited the fortifications of the city, went over all the positions of the battlefield of Marengo, and did not return to the house until 7 o'clock in the evening, after having tired out 5 horses. Some days later, he wished the empress to see this famous plain, and by his orders, an army of 25 or 30,000 men was there assembled. In the morning of the day fixed for the review of these troops, the emperor issued from his apartment clad in a long waistcoat, blue coat with tails, much worn and inventoried in various places. These holes were the work of moths and not of balls, as has been wrongly said in certain memoirs. His Majesty had on his head an old hat bordered by a white gold band, blackened and raveled by time, and at his side the cavalry saber, which were worn by the generals of the Republic. They were the coat, hat, and saber he had worn the very day of the Battle of Marengo. I afterwards lent this suit to Monsieur David, first painter of His Majesty, for his picture of the crossing of the Mont Saint-Bernard. A vast amphitheater had been erected in the plain for the Empress and the suite of their Majesties. The day was magnificent, as nearly all the days of May are in Italy. After having gone through the lines, the Emperor sat down beside the Empress and distributed crosses of the Legion of Honor to the troops. Afterwards, he laid the first stone of the monument he had ordered to be raised in the plain to the memory of the heroes who had died in that battle. When His Majesty, in the short speech he made on this occasion to his army, pronounced in a loud but profoundly moved voice the name of to say, who died gloriously here for the country, An audible shudder of anguish was heard in the ranks of the soldiers. For my part, I was affected to tears, and with my eyes fixed upon this army, these flags, that costume of the empire, I had to turn from time to time towards the throne of the empress to rid myself of the notion that we were still living on the 14th of June in the year 1800. I think that it was during the sojourn in Alexandria that Prince Jerome Bonaparte had an interview with the emperor in which the latter addressed some serious and sharp admonitions to his young brother. Prince Jerome came out of the cabinet in visible agitation. The emperor's dissatisfaction arose from the marriage contracted by his brother at the age of 19 with the daughter of an American merchant. His Majesty had broken this marriage on the ground of minority and had issued a decree forbidding officers of the civil state to place upon their registers the transmission of the act of celebration of the marriage of Monsieur Jerome and Miss Patterson. For some time, the emperor treated him coldly, kept him at a distance, but a few days after the interview at Alexandria, he sent him to Algiers to reclaim as the subjects of the empire 200 Genoese retained in slavery. The young prince acquitted himself very happily of this humane errand and returned to the port of Genoa in August with the captives whom he had delivered. The emperor was satisfied with the manner in which his brother had followed his instructions, and he said on this occasion that Prince Jerome was very young, very giddy, and that he needed some lead in his brains, but that nevertheless he expected to make something of him. This brother of his Majesty belonged to the small number of persons whom he particularly loved, although he had often given him very just reasons for being angry with him.